Okay, thanks a lot for inviting us. It's an honor to be here. We've been talking about the ripple effects of COVID-19. More broadly, we think this paper was thinking hard about what are going to be the persistent consequences of a very large temporary shock. And this is joint work with Andy Neumeyer, Hugo, Hopenhayn, Roberto, Fattal-Jaef, and Yongseok, Shin. I guess I guess all the papers in this quarter will need very little motivation. But well, let me just give you a little bit of a narrow focus of where we're coming from, what's the perspective we're going to take about the COVID-19 crisis. So this project, in the very beginning of this project, was a way to understand what would be the consequences of very large, widespread lockdowns that occurred early in the pandemic. And we saw them, and to a large extent, the large set of countries, we see those as a very, very large, very unusually large. For many countries, will be the largest shocks in many decades. That will have a very, some of it have a very, I mean, those restrictions have a very transitory, would be a very transitory phenomenon. And the question is we're trying to address is to what extent those transitory restrictions, but unusually large, we have persistent effect. A second motivation of the project that will come later on in the presentation is something that started becoming clear early on in the pandemic, is the fact that there seems to be changes of a more permanent nature, and those changes has to do with more permanent reshuffling on the way we consume and we produce. So I want to contrast these two features of the pandemic, and part of these permanent changes may not be necessarily ripple effects of the transitory shock, but might be some innovations that will have more persistent effects, and that may affect the way we do things. So going to be so more narrow. This paper will be a relatively agnostic quantitative exploration of these two questions. So what are going to be the persistent effects of a very large, and emphasize the large part of it, of the transitory shock. And in doing that, we like to also try to understand the contribution of lockdowns, maybe the relocation component of this more permanent reshuffling of the way we consume and produce, and other aspects of the pandemic, like a demand type of shock, and so on and so forth. I want to do this, exploring this in a model with financial frictions, coupled with labor market frictions. And we're not going to do an agnostic exploration in the sense of we're going to try to explore the role of potentially labor market policies that were instituted to deal with the pandemic, different institutions, for example, the way labor markets might work differently across countries, or financial markets might work differently across countries. And we're also going to explore very broadly what will be the consequences of shock of different sizes. And as we're going to show you in a second, there's in the cross-section of countries, the magnitude of lockdowns and the initial shock is very widespread. And also the persistence of the shock, and that kind of tied in a little bit with the initial words in the introduction. Just to have a little bit of what we have in mind, so this figure in the x-axis will show you the drop in GDP in the second quarter of 2020 over a wide set of OECD countries. And these are going to be, we all know, it's going to be large unusual shocks. GDP drops of 10% are very common, but you get a drop of over 20% in countries like UK and Spain. Another feature of the graph, when you look at the y-axis, it tells you what were the experience by the third quarter of 2020. For many of these countries, GDP recovered relatively fast. Still, there's quite a bit of a spread across countries, but they're much closer to recover. And some countries, for example, New Zealand, recovered more than recovered by the third quarter. This is a look. This is a look at more detail at two examples. One would be US. The US, this would be a country where we'll be calibrating our model. And the other one would be New Zealand. I guess New Zealand is interesting in the sense that it would be an example with a very short-lived lockdown. And so it would be, I guess, our foster child of a very transitory large shock. But even in the US, where the pandemic went through all through 2020, you see a very quick recovery. Interesting, you're going to see a large drop in consumption as well as investment, but a quick bounce back. In the US, you see a large drop in employment, less than perfect bounce back by the end of the year. And in New Zealand, you see a smaller drop in employment initially, but a more persistent drop thereafter of a smaller magnitude. Another feature of the pandemic is stress, and this will be taken more to what we're going to call the relocation component of the shock. There were more permanent changes in the way we do production. That's triggered by the pandemic, but might not be necessarily themselves pure ripple effects of the transitory shock. It's going to be the fact that there was a drop in this is going to be data from a series of new business applications. It's a new series that has been using in the US recently. Handy Wanger have been discussing this in his own work this past year. This is the data on the number of new business applications, sort of a very high frequency series of that. It comes at the weekly, it's a weekly series. And where you see that the red line will be the numbers for 2020. You see a significant drop in new business applications that coincide with the pandemic. But interesting, you see a boom in business applications through the second half of 2020. And the other lines would be data for the years before 2020, and here we also see the effect of the Great Recession. So you see both a decline in business formation early on in the pandemic, but then you see a very large boom on business formation. And that's, I mean, there's not much time to discuss it, but you can go through history, other examples of large transitory shock. One example that we've been looking at, I spent time looking at a bit, was the Fukushima meltdown. I mean, the earthquake in Japan in 2011 that has a very large temporary effect on Japanese output, more dramatic in the output of the Fukushima prefecture, and you see that output drop almost fully undone by a year after. So that's a type of large shock more broadly that we like to understand. Okay, so we're gonna do the rest of my time. We just briefly describe a model that we're gonna use to think about these large shocks, and then go through a baseline exercise when I think about a one period lockdown of economic activity on a large subset of the sectors would be a very harsh lockdown. So for a subset of the sectors, the firm would not be allowed to produce. And then that lockdown will be lifted. And then in terms of policy, we're going to be through. So in that lockdown will be coupled with a demand shock, will be a shock that will affect the marginal utility of consumption during the lockdown. That will be declining, and that will be chosen so we can match the behavior of investment and consumption in the US in Q2. During the lockdown, first will be liable for the rental of debt payments, but the wage bill will be paid by the government, either because they will be transferred to firms from the government to pay the wage bill, or because workers will be temporarily laid off and their wages will be paid through unemployment insurance. So large extent what happened in the US. And this will be financed with government debt. They're going to go through a sensitivity analysis of the effects of the shock. We consider lockdowns of very wide scale of size, and also duration. And then, so we have time. We're going to talk through what are the elements in the model. The important part of the element in the model will be key to understand this effect of the shock will be the ability of firms to recall temporarily layoff workers, so we're going to refer to as recent employment. And this might not have time to go through in detail, but we're also going to consider a second type of shock that will be a relocation shock. There will be a shock that will lead to a subset of firms to withdraw their productivity. And we compare the two types of shocks. In terms of the structure of the model, will be a model with heterogeneous agents. The key part of it, the major heterogeneity will be in terms of individuals' productivity as entrepreneurs of ability to run firms. There will be occupational choices between running firms or working for a wage. There will be a stochastic process for the individual productivity of entrepreneurs that will follow this simple stochastic process of, for example, probability psi. Firms keep the previous productivity with probability 1 minus psi. Firms draw a new productivity from a Pareto distribution to be able to match the skewness of the firm size distribution. There will be a credit friction. There will be a simple quadratic constraint. The amount of capital invested will be proportional to the net worth of an individual entrepreneur. And there will be a labor friction. There will be a simple matching friction with the ability to option for rest and employment. And in terms of the way we're going to model the lockdown, will be a fraction of firms' fee. We're going to call non-essentials will have to shut down during the lockdown. There also will be a demand shock. As I said before, there will be lower in marginality of consumption in the period of the lockdown. And we're going to also consider at the end a relocation shock that will be an increase in the probability of firms to withdraw their productivity. So for the non-essential firms, for a period, the probability of keeping the previous productivities will go down. In terms of model, this will be a combination of model with Roberto, Fattal-Jaef, and Shin that we used to think about the Great Recession, enriched to have a simple notion of rest and employment. It's in average Scheimer. Okay, so this really don't have much time to go in detail here, but there will be individuals making decisions between saving and consumption, occupational choices, and that will depend on individuals' productivity and current net worth. Current net worth affect the profitability of entrepreneurs, and the profit of entrepreneurs is given by this function. Where key elements in the productivity of the entrepreneur will be this collateral constraint. We're going to have a very generous unemployment insurance, so will be a full replacement of wages. So in some sense, the problem of an employed worker or an employed worker is going to be identical. So that would be allow us to do away with will stay variables. And we're going to have that employment insurance going to be partially debt financed over a horizon of length T. The key distinction will be in the period of the lockdown will be between non-essential and essential business. And non-essential business we have we not be able to produce in that period. And importantly, we have to repay their debt payments or the capital rentals. So the key assumption of the lockdown happened at the beginning of the period after all production decisions were taking place. Importantly, we will not have to pay for the wage bill, but we have to pay for the capital rental contracts or the debt payments. And in the special cases, this will be only happen for a period. More generally, that will might happen for more than one period. We think of two periods longer, we can have 2 or 3 periods, more periods long those. The labor friction will be fairly simple. There will be a matching friction that will be they will give me the first equation. There will be a number of workers that will match in a period on what I'm going to refer to a higher market. There's going to be a fraction gamma of the currently the employed workers at the beginning of the period plus the job destruction in that period. The very simple law of motion of the unemployment will be the employed workers tomorrow will be 1 minus gamma of the unemployed at the beginning of the period plus the new job destruction. Job destruction will be given by these equations. It will be the change in employment between last period for individual firm between last period employment to current period employment, and there will be a simple variation high labor market within the higher for the matched workers. So that the labor demand in a period has to be equal to the amount of workers. The labor supply will be workers that are not going to be unemployed at the end of the period. But you want the workers that arrive to the higher market. This will be without rest employment. With rest employment, we will be doing is allowing workers that were hired by a given firm the previous period to be reemployed without having to go through the higher market. And it will be not an interesting option in the initial steady state, but will be an interesting option upon a transitory lockdown shock. So this will be an option that will be useful for non-essential workers. They're going to be not going to be relocated in the first period, and that option will be available only for surviving firms and those firms that are willing to hire those workers, and that would be a function of their networks. So a key role of financial friction in this model will be to affect the willingness of firms, non-essential firms, to hire workers that were laid off in the recent past. So and that's in terms of the math. That's how this will be affected. So let me just try to go quickly to the results. So we have a simple calibration of the model to the US, pre-lockdown data. What I'm going to do now is going to analyze the one period lockdown case. Again, what is a lockdown will be, the shock will be, we're going to start with a stationary allocation. There will be an expected shock, such as the fraction fee of business we're going to consider non-essential. They will have to be closing for that period. In the benchmark case, there will be 10% of the firms. That will give us a drop in GDP as we observe in the US in the Q2. That will be the last for one period. We're going to give you quickly soon sensitivity to the size of the shock, the fraction of firms that are going to be required to close, and the length of it. So I guess the main results will be the baseline result will be this. So it's a lockdown. So 10% of the firms are required to close. That will be mechanically accounting for the drop of 10% of GDP. Simultaneously, there will be a demand shock, and demand shock will be important in imagine the fact that consumption also will be dropped. I will match the relative drop in consumption and investment. If we're thinking of the way the wage support is done through the employment insurance, there will be a 9% rise in unemployment in the first period. Interestingly, this shock will almost fully wash out after a period. So it will be almost a full recovery in GDP and consumption, and it's relatively sluggish response in investment, and almost a full recovery in unemployment. There will be a persistent unemployment of 0.5% in the second quarter. That's fully explained by the fact that some non-residential firms, the net worth of some non-residential firms will be affected for the shock. Prices will be barely moving, so let me skip this for consequence times. So the main key message of the baseline model will be that the lockdown will have a very transitory effect in the aggregate. We have large effects in the micro data. So particularly with respect to this large shock to have a large effect in a subset of the firms in the model will be relatively more financially constrained. So firms whose network is relatively low, and the shock will affect the network of those firms, and because of that, they will have to affect the size of operations. So there will be a figure showing you the effect of the lockdown among the young firms. So in the first period, it's going to be non-essential young firms, will be the red one. On the first period, the firm will be shutting down, so the employment, effective employment will drop to zero. But after a period when the lockdown is lifted, the firm will be 20% below what they would have been have not had the life cycle would have been had they not have been exposed to the shock the previous period. So it's going to be a very large effect on the young firms, not so much on the more mature firm because it's going to be not financially constrained. But importantly, those young firms will tend to be the contribution of employment of young firms on the aggregate will be relatively small, so that this large effect on the young firm will have a small effect on the aggregate of, as we showed you before, of 0.5% of unemployment. And this is showing you the whole distribution of employment growth in the second period relative to the period before the lockdown. And the top panel will show you the distribution of, the distribution of firm growth, and the bottom panel will be the distribution of firm growth weighted by the employment size, initial employment size. So that's the thing that we just see that there's going to be a large effect among the young firms, non-essential young firms, non-essential firms, but a lot of that effect going to translate to the aggregate due to the fact that the young firms going to account for a small fraction of the employment. So I guess what you see is it's a very quick recovery in the aggregate and a very large effect in the cross section of firms. Again, I show you mentioned the effects on consumption. These effects I mentioned early on. The effects on consumption will be very heterogeneous across types in the model. More importantly, among young entrepreneurs, they will be take a large fraction of the hit on the consumption relative to, say, to workers for whom consumption dropped mostly because of the demand shock, given the fact we have a very generous unemployment insurance in the model. So quickly, we have 5 minutes.
Yes, you have 6 minutes.
6 minutes. So I'm going to briefly mention a little bit of sensitivity to this two features of the way we model the shock. One will be the size of the shock. We have a shock of 10% on impact. So we show you in the figure early on, there will be it's a wide cross section on how large was the GDP drop in Q2 across the OECD countries. And the other graph we're going to show you is in the baseline case, we have a lockdown that's amount to very large shock in the first quarter, but fully recovers a quarter after in terms of these restrictions on how firms are able to operate. So we consider longer durations of lockdown. The bottom line of this will be, results will be fairly linear with respect to the size of the shock. So the effects on the amount of persistence of the effects will be, you don't get much more in terms of endogenous propagation other than the effects on capillary accumulation through the size of the lockdown. But you're gonna get a big effect through the duration. So it will be these are similar figures for one period lockdown shocks of the varying sizes. The baseline was the blue line is 10% lockdown. We have a 20% and a 30%. So think about UK, Spain will be between the 20% and the 30%. And what you see, at least when you look at this in linear scale, is that there's going to be a very quick rebound, independent of the size of the shock. Both in employment, in GDP, and unemployment. Obviously, the larger the shock, the more investment will be reactive, and because investment will be dropping, partially to smooth out the shock, you're going to have a more persistent through capillary accumulation. Another margin that will be effects will be affected will be the fiscal front. So we're gonna have a full replacement. So the effects on deficit will be increased linearly with the size of the lockdown. And this is more of a showing you a little bit of you see some more persistent because of capillary accumulation, and when you look in the log scale, you see more of these effects. In terms of the micro implications, there are not going to be much effect. It's going to be affected in the sense of a fraction of firms that will be affected. By condition of being a non-essential firm, you sort of don't care much about whether the shock was to 10% of the firm, 20% of the firm, or 30% of the firm. If anything, it's slightly better for you to have more firm affected because factor prices will be more in your favor. Things will be a little bit different when you think of the duration of the shock. Think of this as the duration of the lockdown. In this case, we're going to show you here the x-axis is going to be quarters after the lockdown were lifted. So period 2, I guess period here we're going to show you from the period after the lockdown was lifted onward. So this is not calendar time. It's not calendar time with respect to the time of the shock. And the blue line is the benchmark. You say, well, it was a GDP drop of 0.5%, roughly speaking, after the shock lifted. Here you see that you're going to have one more period of lockdown. You're going to have a larger effect on the period after the lockdown. And these effects will be fairly persistent. So in terms of unemployment, you're going to see unemployment lingering for much longer after the lockdown were raised. So that's the dimensions where effects will get amplified very largely. And obviously, the micro implication of these will be much more dramatic. Now you think of a non-essential firm that was locked down not for one period, but for 2 periods. Now, after the lockdown, this firm will be 40% away from what would have been the life cycle without the shock. So in this case, the net worth of firms will be more severely affected, and that will have more larger, more persistent people effects. So in terms of what to expect, so we learn from this exercise, it's not so much the problem is the size of the initial shock. So how large was the initial lockdown? It's more a question of how persistent this was the duration of this lockdown. I guess in Chile you have probably a neighbor with a very long lockdown that would be an example of this case. So now one thing that we do in the paper is going to explore a bit the role of the different shocks. There's a demand shock, there's a lockdown shock, and also there's the role of allowing firms not to pay the wage bill during the shock, and the rest of employment. And this is going to be very important margins. I guess the key point that I want to maybe focus now is the wage bill. So in a sense, if you you can imagine a case where firms were required to pay the wage bills during the lockdown and not have wage support. Then this figure, I guess the blue line will be the benchmark case, the green line will be a case without wage support. One period lockdown without wage support, so that would be put an extra hit on firms' balance sheet. Now you're going to start seeing more persistent unemployment after the lockdown was lifted. So we amount to 1% of unemployment following the lockdown period. Even, I mean, in that case, you can think of unemployment in the period of the lockdown is zero because firms were required to keep the workers in their books, but there will be amounts that will be very costly in terms of the net worth, and that would be amount to a very more persistent unemployment. And obviously, the rate of unemployment is key. Without that assumption, you're going to get a much longer duration, more persistent unemployment. So I guess I'm probably close to being out of time. So the last part of the paper we talk about, we consider a relocation shock. And the way we model the relocation shock is going to be that, as I've said, of the non-essential firms, their productivity will be withdrawn upon the pandemic. And that will going to lead to a burst of exits of non-essential firms and entry of new non-essential firms. And that we will have in mind is this figure on new business entry. And I guess the bottom line is that this type of shock is going to be very different than the lockdown shock. This type of shock without financial friction or labor friction should have no effect on the aggregate, because the shock that only reshuffling who is good at producing what, but doesn't affect the cross-sectional distribution of productivity. But the shock will require an excess allocation of labor and capital across firms, and that will have more persistent, larger effect. So here we're comparing a case where it's a lockdown of 10% of the firms, affecting 10% of the firms, but on top of that, there's a reshuffling of 30% of these non-essential firms, and this shock will have more persistent effect. I guess probably I should finish. With that, I guess So I guess this is our way to think about this very heterogeneous experience of firms across countries and in this almost past year since the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much, Francisco, for your presentation. Now we have 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Please, if you have a question, post it on the Q&A window, and I will read the question for you.
Alberto, I think Cristina Lozano has a question.
Yes.
Cristina?
So, Paco, very interesting paper. Of course, an essential question is how persistent this is going to be. So I had a question regarding the initial figures you showed for the United States. If you looked at employment, and you showed this, as opposed to unemployment, you see that, there was unemployment too, but employment had a big decline, a recovery, but then maybe half of a recovery, right? And it's still quite depressed. Mm-hmm. So I didn't get at the end, in the context of your model, whether you can get that type of sluggish recovery until now, and what would be the factors behind that? So, you had the capital accumulation, but is it, like, if you do a decomposition, I guess that's what you guys are going, what would be the rationale for that, one? And the second part question is, traditionally, recessions, unemployment rate has come down, it seems to me, slower than what it's come down this time around. And so also, if you had a sense of, what is it different in terms of this recession relative to before, if in fact this recession has a faster recovery.
Thank you, Cristina. So I guess our way to understand the additional source of persistence of the shock, we have two dimensions that with which we do that, or two mechanisms with which we do that in the model. One is by considering shocks that are more persistent than a one period lockdown. So in the 2 period lockdown, that one has and the other persistent will be the persistent after the shock has gone. In that case, that will lead you to a larger persistent effect. So when we interpret the US is true for about a large set of the sectors, lockdowns were lifted by June, but for some of them, the effective fall in demand persisted for longer. There were limits in the way some activities were being performed even after June, or some states where those restrictions were more persistent. That will go some way to affect that. The other way we're going to think in our model will be through this relocation shock, and this is the sense of which the nature of a lot of activities change, partially because of the fact that people are consuming differently, but some of these effects might be more permanent. Maybe airlines will have fewer business travel even after the pandemic subsides, and that's because firms realize that they can do without so much business travel, and that's what we thought about. That's what we try to capture with the relocation shock. The fact that there's a more persistent change in the profitability of individual firms. In the aggregate, that wouldn't have an effect the way we model it, because those are just reshuffling the productivity across potential entrepreneurs. But that will be another sort of more persistent effect, and that those two will go some way accounting for the fact that unemployment both employment and unemployment haven't recovered. So those extensions are meant to think about that. Thank you.
It seems that there's no question from the public. If you're panelists, you can just raise your hand and ask Sophia to open your microphone. I think Andrea want to say something.
There's a question in the Q&A also.
I can see it.
Okay, it's
okay. So my question was very well. First of all, very nice paper. I enjoyed it a lot attending it. I have a question about your the correspondence between the model and the data you showed at the beginning, also because it related to some data we'll show later for Spain. And so you showed that in the US, in terms of business applications, there was a big decline, but then a kind of overshooting. In terms of your model, it seemed to me that I didn't see the same type of pattern. And so my first question is whether, it's a correct interpretation of your model that shows like a slower recovery in entry. And if so, why do you think is the case? And then the second part is a possible explanation. Is it possible that this business application could be frictional entrepreneurs, so like necessity entrepreneurs that while they are looking for more stable jobs, in the meanwhile they apply for some type of own business?
Yeah. So in terms of the model, the last case will capture this burst of business creation. So the relocation shock almost mechanically will result in a subset of international firms to exit because their productivity was changed. and a burst of entry a new firm. I mean, in the model will happen within a period, maybe a little bit longer. There will be some longer on the dynamic, but most of them will occur on very fast. So I guess you can imagine a version that is more a smooth version of that. And I guess in the data there's some evidence of what you said. For example, there are two series that the business new business formation shows. I show you only what they call the high propensity business. I mean, they have four series. One is all business application. One is high propensity. That new business that are likely to hire workers in the future. That's the one I'm showing you. But one that I show you less impressive overshoot is the one that by both. One they call the corporations. So you look at corporation, you see the decline and then a boom, but it's less dramatic. And the ones that are already hiring workers also give you a less dramatic boom. I say that it seems to be new business formation according to the census that they're kind of likely predicted to hire workers, even though they may not be hiring workers right away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. And please, if you're going to post a question, do that in the Q&A section, not in the chat section. There are two different windows. But,
and I answered to one of the questions of Cristina, now I remember. So in terms of the question of why is different between this recovery in employment and a previous one, I guess a big part is that the shock by itself is very transitory and it's kind of understood by many firms to be transitory, at least the initial part of the lockdown shock. And recent employment is responsible for having this very rapid recovery in employment. Without that assumption in the model, there will be a more longer, more protracted recovery in employment. So I think the fact that the lockdowns were temporary, were perceived to be temporary, explains to a large extent why the recovery was initially part of the recovery was very, very, very quick, both in employment and output. So I meant to highlight that when I look at the different contribution of more elements, but done that very quickly.
Andrés, I think you have a question. You have a couple of extra minutes.
I think we have one question in the audience, Alberto, from
Marcus.
Yes,
Marcus asked a question. I'm going. Okay, now you.
Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. Thank you, Francisco. So I have a question. I didn't capture whether your model and how your model captures potential reallocation from labor towards capital, right? Which might be like a relevant factor in the context of this pandemic, and how that does or would affect your results. So you could think about automation, for example, right?
Yeah, I guess we don't have that margin unless you think about some of the what we refer to the relocation shock, also changing the productivity of more labor and capital technologies. But that would be a way to incorporate what you refer to, but we don't have that per se in the current model. But that would be a nice extension that we can look at. That's a good point.